Brilliant. Shalom, everyone, and welcome. We are studying Torah as we study both the ancient and the modern, and as we study both the text of the tradition, but also the inner text, as it were, the inner landscape, which is so important in all of this. So we are studying Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu ruach haolam, Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. La'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. Luther and I are going to be incredibly rude and mute people who aren't yet muted. But at any point, hopefully you should be able to unmute yourself when the opportunity arises, and we'll use it selectively, but awesomely. So welcome, everyone. Quick show of electronic hands. How many of us have read at least some of the opening of God is Here? Nice. Okay, that's a very good smattering. Along with a mix, as is to be expected, and I am grateful for all of it. So I have a whole bunch of resources gathered. Some of them I put together, some of them Toba and a circle of people around her did. And some of you know that there's a three-way friendship from the class of '97 with Rabbi Linda Potemkin in Beth Israel of Media, Pennsylvania, which ironically is the shul that Rabbi Sid started out at when he was a fresh graduate from RRC. And she and Toba and I have this wonderful three-way friendship. So Linda is teaching it simultaneously in her community. And so she and I are sharing some of those resources. So full disclosure, we're sort of, it's a communal enterprise. It is fluid, fluid as befits having mayim, or water, as the core metaphor that we'll be exploring tonight in the second half of our time, because the first half of our time is really to talk about metaphors themselves. So some of you have read, some of you haven't. I hope that those who haven't yet will, and I also trust that those of us who have, this is a book that actually is worth reading multiple times. Evie Resmovic is traveling. She said she's already read it twice. And it's only been out less than a year. So that says something. There's a lot here, and I want to encourage us to use the chat to put good ideas out there, but also at some moments I'll be looking at the chat. At others, perhaps Luther or other helpful folk could be kind of watching, to see if there's anything that's important in housekeeping. And at a number of points, I'm going to stop the screen share and move us into some real conversation and reflection. So with all of that, share screen, metaphors, PDF, here we go. Right, and 28 more pages. Yes. Okay. So lots that we're gonna get to. I didn't enable sound, so we'll do the music later. But I wanted us to just begin with, before even going to stop the screen share, which is usually easier than this. There we go. Names and metaphors. There are many of us, and the beauty of Zoom is we see each other's names. Imagine for just a moment, this is very not Kaplanian, that God was in one of these boxes on Zoom. Works better if you're in gallery view for the image, right? God is in a box. if we think of it, so to speak, metaphorically, God does not like to be put into a box, right? Don't box God in, which in many ways is exactly where we're going. But just to play it for a minute, if God were in a box, what might be those handful of characters on the lower left of God's box? Okay, so for starters, oh, Evie is here. Yeah, thank you. All right, for starters, use the chat and let's have some fun with it. What are some possibilities? Remember that you typically only get 25 or 30 characters in Zoom. And again, we're putting God in a box. So what good 25 or 30 character, whether a name, a metaphor, an image, a quote? Okay, Hashem is above me and to the left on Zoom. I like it. Okay, YHVH, aka Jehovah, aka Yahweh, and more famously Yud-He Vav-He, the closest thing we have to a proper name of God in our tradition. Inspiration, divine, awe, connecting light, cosmic hearth. Eheyeh asher eheyeh, I am what I am, or I will be who I will be. Judy channeling both George Lucas and Mordecai Kaplan, God is the force. May the force be with you, right? Creator, Holy One, question marks with a little a Spanish flair there. I like it, Tom, thank you. Lev or heart, the one who cannot be muted. Leave it to Ralph for the best laugh line. And John, that is beautiful. And can you translate? Okay. I think Phyllis is, are you actually saying that God's box would say definitely no video? Like, because no one can see me and live. That's a quote from Exodus 33. So yeah, I like it. Okay, God in nature, excellent. Some beautiful possibilities. So we're already beginning to have some fun with it. And we just need to remember, God is nature. Thank you. Yes. Thank you, John. We need to remember that, and this is a famous line from Judith Plaskow in 1990, standing again at Sinai, which was the first full-length Jewish feminist theology, and in many ways is the follow-up volume to Mordecai Kaplan's writings, because she is very much in a Kaplanian mode, but specifically with the advances of feminism and the advent of women's studies as a discipline, and asking some questions that Kaplan was relatively early in addressing, but nonetheless, it didn't have the plausibility structure for it. So there's a through line from Mordecai Kaplan and Ira Eisenstein to Judith Plaskow, and thence to Toba Spitzer and the rest of us who are functioning in these days. And Judith Plaskow famously wrote, criticism of received images of God is not, of course, criticism of God. So we just need to remember that, because we are bringing a critical eye to the metaphors that maybe don't work as well. And in a sense, a name is nothing but a metaphor, because for God, everything is partial. There is no name, there is no attribute or midah, there is no metaphor, there is no phrase, there is no definitive volume, or right, that could, right, if the one thing we know about God is ineffable or unknowable or infinite, ein sof, without end, then we are in new territory here. And that is, I think, exciting. So we are going to criticize the received images of God, and we are going to explore some that have lain in many ways invisible to us. They were there all along. but they needed this moment in order to emerge. Okay, so that is the beginning reflection. And I want us now to, I'm going to call on Arthur, and if there were any other hands, go ahead. But also in the chat, if you just want to name some metaphors, if you've already read Toba, you've got a storehouse, and maybe if you have read, try to challenge yourself to come up with a metaphor of God that isn't in the book. And if you haven't yet read it, then tabula rasa, anything goes. But just let's collect some metaphors for God while we hear a couple of quick reflections on the opening. Hey, Arthur, please. Or not, right? Arthur? It says you're unmuted. Okay. Okay, were there other hands up? Anyone want to offer a quick reflection or clarification or question thus far? Good. Okay. Then let's keep. Tom, you unmuted?
Yes, I did, accidentally, but I did have my physical hand up. At the risk of asking the question that seems to have been elided over in her book, what are we talking about when we're talking about God in the first place? She speaks of spiritual experiences, and she speaks of ways of exploring truths about the world, developing truths about the world, but moves on rather directly to metaphors, water, stone, whatever, but I'm not sure what they're metaphors of.
Nice. So you caught her and us, right? Every Reconstructionist rabbi is guilty of this. But I am happily guilty and happily a student of Toba who is a master of this. We understand that the very word God has a lot of baggage, right? And Hashem has different baggage, and Adonai has different baggage. And, right, basically any image, any name, any metaphor is going to already come with a semantic field and an emotional feel that goes with it. And all of our doubts and all of our questions and all of our beliefs and all of our affirmations and everything we learned in childhood that we liked and everything we learned in childhood that we rejected, and sometimes it's the same thing, it all comes up for us. So we like to kind of skim this line and talk about the divine or divinity or spirituality or spirit or ultimacy. And those, in a sense, are all perfectly valid synonyms for God. Mordecai Kaplan, in his diary entry, and if you want more on this, come to the Intro to Recon, one session on this Sunday morning and then a 4-part deep dive over the winter. On a train back from St. Louis in 1937, he writes, I had the chance to teach Torah and meet wonderful people, and now I am being whisked at remarkable speed toward home with a fine meal en route. Things are good. I thank the life, love, and intelligence of the universe for this moment. Right? And of course, those are all capital letters. Life, love, intelligence, universe. Any one of those could be a name of God. The four together is personally one of my favorites. So when I talk about God, if I had to give one answer to Tom's question, right, what are these metaphors of? These are metaphors for the life, love, and intelligence of the universe that some people image as a anthropomorphic, mostly male deity who often intervenes in human affairs and then sometimes stays puzzlingly silent, right? And others of us accept that images like force or energy field, thank you, Fran, that those are actually in some ways more potentially accurate descriptors of God. We don't know. We will probably never know. So one of the questions is, can we breathe into and accept the idea that we're talking about something inherently undefinable and fuzzy, which also means something different than what we were taught? And call it divinity, or call it the life, love, and intelligence of the universe. And we are coming up with a range of metaphors. And if each one is a partial truth and none of them is a total truth, the more we explore, the better a sense we'll have of what this divinity thing, this God notion, might actually be. Not sure that's a satisfying answer. It's the best I can do without taking the rest of the class on it. So other thoughts, perfectly welcome. Ralph, please.
Ralph Nicken has.
Yes, yeah. I was going to say that we're here on this two-dimensional plane through some miracle of evolution, and we're just existing here. And I think that the aspiration we have, the reason we try to be purposeful and do something right, to me, all that aspiration, all that goodness, anything we do on the positive side, to me, that's my sense of God. You know, why do we care? Why do we try to connect in the first place instead of just being selfish, isolated entities? That connection to me is God.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So connection, right? Ralph, by simply introducing the idea that we have to go beyond ourselves into community, is also being kept good and Keplanian or Spitzerian, as it were. Yeah, a beautiful move to make. I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. So rock is a fine example of a metaphor. Thank you, Barb. Those of us who were lucky enough to be there on last Shabbat, and she will join us in at our middle session, and we'll explore rock a little more. God is the explanation for the existence of everything, right? And as Toba reminds us, at one level, the God concept grew and became universal as people were simply straining to answer questions of why and how and what. And over time, science became the organizing principle for most of us, where we go to answer those questions. And the gross oversimplification is that science is really good at telling us how and at describing what, but not always the final source for the question of why, or what does this mean, right? And that's where science and philosophy coexist and cross into each other, and with philosophy, theology, or religion. Okay, so lots to explore. We're going to jump in with a couple of introductory ideas and then deep into metaphor land. All right, we are only planned for 3 sessions right now. To state the obvious, each chapter could be an entire 90 minutes of its own. And we may find that that's what it ends up happening, because we don't get nearly as far as I had expected. So it goes. But the idea of tonight was to do the opening ideas of what is metaphor and throwing our divinity concepts wide open. And then one example, a particularly rich one, of water. And then, if possible, we're going to look at 3 different metaphors for the next one: place, sound, and rock. And that leaves 4 more metaphors for the final. We may realize we need to tack on a session. I'm also in touch with Toba and with Linda about those 3 friends doing a joint session, if we can schedule it, where we would have an evening with the author, with 2 communities that she is no stranger to. So November 30th, December 14th, hope to see you at all of them. If not, don't worry about it and come to what you can. And if you can obtain, borrow, beg, I would not steal, that would kind of not be very godly, but or download, etc. A copy, go for it. Reminder, there's a whole lot else and it all overlaps. She is in Boston and he is friends with and a student of Rabbi David Jaffe, and quotes him. And we will, our next book group, actually the larger Our Next Book group, is with another Jewish feminist theologian, you might say, or maybe more to the point, poet and novelist. Sherry Lincoln is with us, and she will be introducing us to Marge Piercy as novelist, and my personal favorite novel of all time, He, She, It, which is in so many ways a beautiful continuation of this, and then a prefiguring of the Musar that we'll be doing, Musar and activism, among other themes, with Rabbi David Jaffe when we discuss his book. So there's so much coming up, and I hope that you avail yourself of it. Never mind norms and expectations. We know what we're doing. All right. We are shifting off of the question, does God exist? As if to say the answer is, it don't matter. The question is, what is ultimacy? Where do we find ourselves with an experience of something beyond? And what metaphors can we use both to describe what we ourselves are willing to acknowledge from our own experience, and also what we have a record of others saying was their experience or their notion, which is all good as literature and all good as family scrapbook. It's all our heritage, our birthright, our inheritance. Doesn't mean it's true. Sinai, Exodus, great stories, who knows? But at least as metaphor, right, those are incredibly powerful. So we know from Sinai, God is revealer, God is teacher. Some would say commander, instructor, right, lawgiver. But the core of Torah is teaching, and teaching not from the place of knows everything and is trying to get you there, but kind of God stands for knowledge. Divinity is knowing, and knowing, of course, is not just an intellectual, but a deeper knowing. At the same time, Exodus, as our other core story, at least of Torah, is God as liberation, or God as liberator, God as freedom. But of course, freedom with purpose, responsibility. It all connects. Those are the kind of questions that I hope we ask. Not does God exist, but what does it mean that we have the image in our tradition of being made in the image of a creator who is also a revealer and also a redeemer, which means that we have creation in us. We have liberation in us. We have Torah in us. And that's not Toba, right? That's normative Judaism, just slightly reframed. But again, when we get past our God bugaboos, lots is possible. I shared this in the with the listserv, just kind of the quick, let's all get on the same page, this beautiful passage that there's hunger and religious communities have a role to play. And it's helpful to have language to talk about something that is greater than ourselves. And again, you see, she uses the word ultimate. What is ultimate, right? Ultimacy is a fancy word and not one that we easily wrap our heads or even tongues around, but it's one of my favorite synonyms for divinity because it's really asking those questions, right? What is ultimate for us? And ultimacy with a capital U might just be one of those modern names, as it were, or perhaps metaphors for God. Okay. So something in human experience touches the sacred. And we need multiple metaphors in order to get there, because no one will do it. Throughout human history, as far as we know, there's been some notion of connecting with the realm of the sacred, the numinous, whatever. And our ancestors gave us all kinds of different ways, and other people's ancestors gave them lots of other ways. And we are blessed to live in an era when we can learn with and from each other. So if you've learned Dharma, if you've learned Gospel, if you've learned Hadith and Sharia, then bring it as we go, because it's all potentially there. Again, some of it is our birthright, and some of it we make sure our kids learn in Limud program because we think it's worth focusing on for our subset of the world, but that in no way means that those are the final answers, the end all be all. Metaphors are not definitions. Again, we need more than one. That beautiful image of 31 flavors. She's describing working in a scoop shop during college in Boston, and 31 flavors and all these incredible, right, fantastic, ridiculous combinations. Think Ben and Jerry's, or think your favorite independent local ice cream store here or elsewhere. And a parent walks in with a kid old enough to have a clue, but young enough to not easily be able to read words like praline, and says, "Dad, what are these choices?" And he basically says, "How about chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry?" And it broke her heart as the scooperista at the moment. But that image stayed with her from all those decades ago, that we are richer because we have all of those flavors available. And some of us really like strawberry cheesecake ice cream. And some of us say, if I want strawberry cheesecake, I will have cheesecake. Why would I want that in my ice cream, right? It's not a metaphor that's going to work for some of us. It's not a flavor that's going to work for some of us. But the fact that that same place also has a triple chocolate mocha caramel crunch, right? Like, okay, now you're talking my language, right? But I also will go for a good mango sorbet, which is very different, right? We all have this in us. No one metaphor can capture it all. We wouldn't want our favorite ice cream flavor all the time, because variety itself is a value. So it is with metaphor. Many metaphors revolve around the image of God as all-powerful. It's the God as all-powerful metaphor. Really, it's the field of metaphors that imply that. King and Lord and commander and the knower of all, foreseer of all, right? All of those are sort of in one family, right? There are other families, there are other genuses, there may be other phyla and kingdoms out there as well. But we don't need to be stuck with only what we've received. That doesn't mean that sometimes we won't say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, right? That's got a great pedigree. And there are absolutely times when King of the world is the right metaphor. And there are other times when it may not quite be the right metaphor, but it's not worth undoing all of the poetry and melody and semantic range around it, because we don't want to be too literal, right? Ironically, sometimes English speakers who dabble in Hebrew have an easier time with some of these metaphors than thoughtful liberal Jews in Israel or people who speak fluent Hebrew, because then, right, the more time you've spent with Melech as a male king figure in a historical story, then when you see Melech in the prayer book, it's too kingy, right? And there's a reason why we don't even use the translation king, right? We say sovereign. What's a sovereign, right? So no one metaphor can capture it all. God as all-powerful metaphor maybe tries to handle too much. So if we shift a bit in how we experience truth, this is a deep idea on page 13, that what is true for us is some combination of what may be objectively true, actually going on in the world, and our experience of it, which is real, which is true in that moment for us. And so there isn't just an objective list of better metaphors and worse metaphors, of kosher metaphors and treif metaphors, right? Anything goes, and some may be more helpful than others, and some may be more broadly useful and accepted than others. And that is religion, right? Observing the world and formulating truths about it. Very quickly, Barbara King, who Toba cites a bit, this is a deeper dive into her work, Evolving God, thinking of this idea of kind of where religion fits into all of this. As humans, we crave emotional connections with others. That's social science. That was Kaplan's great contribution to Jewish thought, was to bring that into Torah. And this deep desire to connect can be explained by a long evolutionary history with other primates, right? And how humans evolved to become this spiritual ape, the ape with the large brain standing up, creating art. And I love the image, the ape that evolved God, right? The classic image, if God didn't exist, we would have had to invent him, her, it, right? Right, the ape that evolved God. So a desire for emotional connection with the sacred, with the numinous, with something bigger than us, divinity, ultimacy, life, love, and intelligence of the universe, right, is somehow fundamental to the human experience, to our species. And a religious imagination thrives on this human yearning to enter into emotional experience with some force vaster than ourselves. We actually do better when we open those vistas, right? Religious imagination, such a beautiful phrase. And the human religious imagination developed in ever-widening circles of engagement, starting with our immediate posse, out to the larger group, and then cross-group, and then eventually the realm of sacred beings, which of course could be recognizing the inherent divinity of the animal and plant worlds, but it also could be that's where we get angels, and that's where we get gods with a lowercase g, or perhaps God or gods with a capital G. So religion is ultimately all about practice and emotional engagement with the sacred as defined by one social group. It's not necessarily about a set of beliefs concerning supernatural figures. So no, this may be the very first time that we've used the word belief, right? And that's critical here. This is not about what we believe. This is about metaphors that move us and point in partially helpful directions. James Geary, another that she cites often, that recognizing the actual research at the cutting edges of science that metaphorical thinking actually influences our attitudes, beliefs, and actions in surprising, hidden, and often oddball ways. It has leapt off the page and landed with a mighty splash right in the middle of our stream of consciousness. Love that. So metaphors are operative for us in all kinds of ways. Okay, she's got Lakoff and Johnson first, but Sally McFaig. In 1987, a feminist eco-theologian, Sally McFaig, of a liberal Protestant background, wrote a book called Models of God. It was my introduction to metaphorical theology, and one of my all-time favorites, and influential as well for Toba. And then later she actually wrote a book called Metaphorical Theology. And a lot of her early work in second wave feminism, right, this is 1987 after all, was actually building on that previous insight that some metaphors work badly for us. If all we have is the metaphor of God as king, then we are continually reifying not only the notion that God is somehow essentially human or humanoid, but also that God is somehow essentially male. You can't avoid that if you constantly say God is king and there isn't at least a God is queen next to it, right? Or there isn't a God is force, God is water, God is rock, etc. So actually, metaphors can do damage, as it were. They land with off the page and land with a splash in our stream of consciousness, and they change how we think and ultimately how we act. So here, Sally McFaig, one of the classic difficulties with metaphors becoming models, like God as Father, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, right, is they are reified, petrified, and expanded, not only to exclude other models, but to pretend to the status of definitions. God is king. That sentence, we hear that, right? That literally we hear that in church, even sometimes in synagogue. And yet that sounds like a definition when all it was a metaphor. And again, so much so that if you, the moment that you say, our mother, our queen, have compassion upon us, our mother, our queen, be gracious and answer us, though we have little merit, right? Like the moment that we sing Imenu Malkatenu instead of Avinu Malkeinu, it's already, oh, that's weird. Like, okay, I get it, but I'm not quite comfortable with it, because again, reified, petrified, and expanded to exclude other models and pretend to the status of definition. So let's insist instead that models of God are not definitions, but rather likely accounts of experiences of relating to God with the help of relationships we know and understand. So she uses human metaphors, and in Models of God, she talks about God as friend and lover, God as sibling, right? Kind of the lateral image. But then going further in her later work, she brings in some of the same things that Toba does: sun, ocean, rock, mountain, right? Mother and sister as well. Obviously, we are not here defining the nature of God, and nor could we do so if we use less anthropomorphic and naturalistic language. We are not defining the nature of God. But 31 flavors. There's a lot of good stuff out there. Okay. We will go back in a moment to the text. I just wanted to get a little eye contact and maybe another voice or two. Anyone with a thought or question or argument that they want to throw in at this point?
I see a lot of very interesting notes in the chat, starting with Myrna. And
Wow. Yeah.
Some more, and on and on and on.
Right. Okay. So yes, what about the bad attributes? The God is destroyer, God is vengeful. And we're actually going to get there a little bit with water. right? Every metaphor is potentially fraught, right? And that goes back to king, right? At one level, God as king is supposed to be the person in charge of a civil society and looking out for the good of the people or the land. And of course, at the same time, they're petty and they have too many wives and too many horses. I'm just quoting the Torah and prophets there, right? And so king is itself that multivalent metaphor, and so is water, because you can drown, but you can also have that incredible spiritual experience that draws us over and over to the ocean or the lake. So yes, and thank you, and quite right. If we only talk about good stuff, we're actually missing an important piece of all of these metaphors in many ways. Anyone want to give voice while I'm scanning some of these? Takes imagination. None of our heroes are perfect, right, Fran? Common shared language and multiple interpretations. Sherry reminding us of the power of these to have a common discourse and common frames of reference, but each of us with our own sense of what it actually means. And that is part of the beauty of metaphor. There isn't just one right way to take any of them. Source sheet available, sure. In many ways, it's expansion of what's here, but I would be very happy to share afterwards. Email me or we'll figure out a way to put it up. Burning bush, right, that is not consumed, and we're going to get to fire eventually, right? God is connection and community, but also Heschel. We are not alone. God is with us. And that's actually an image in one of the famous water metaphors that Jesse Romer, the wonderful cantor in Philadelphia, has set to music. And it's something I was thinking might be our outro, is the image of when you walk through the water, I will walk with you, says God, right? Like you may think that you're alone in this incredibly challenging moment, but part of the rich set of classical images for God is the God who shows that we're not alone. At the extreme, the famous old footsteps idea of, looking back at the footsteps on the beach when things were really hard, why was there only one set? Where'd you go, God? And like, no, those are actually mine. I was carrying you, right? That's a good example of a theology that I think most of us reject. And yet, as metaphor, there's something to it. So keep playing with it. All right. Any other quick thoughts before we wrap up metaphor and move to water?
So I just want to say that I just think it's so amazing how, on the one hand, I view God as an energy field, the force, all that kind of stuff. And on the other hand, I absolutely love the fact that God is with me and I am not alone. And I like the one set of footprints in the sand. And I like the feeling of being held, and that image of being held. So it's, for me, if I try to be logical, they're totally opposite, but they're there. They're both, it's both and for me. It's really impossible to explain for people who insist on logic.
Right. Can we be fact-loving, empirical people who also recognize that there is a form of meaning that some would call a form of truth, or truthiness, but we can all agree is a form of meaning and a fount of insight, which is in some ways beyond logic. It is beyond the empirical. And if we can open ourselves to that, it doesn't mean that we kick science to the curb and embrace all the literal faith claims of yore, but we can tap some real power that way. So thank you, Fran.
Yeah, one thing that helps me is the notion of presence. You know, that there are these psychoanalysts, contemporary psychoanalysts who use that term, and there are all kinds of weird ways that presence just emerges in dreams, however. And that can be, and that is what Fran, I think, is getting at in terms of this palpable sense of being held sometimes, you know. So anyway, that's something that for me is extraordinarily helpful, the notion of presence.
Nice.
Fred, this is Vita. I'm off video, but I'd like to share a poem by Ruth Brin.
Yay.
When men were children, they thought of God as a father. When men were slaves, they thought of God as a master. When men were subjects, they thought of God as a king. But I am a woman, not a slave, not a subject, not a child who longs for God as father or mother. I might imagine God as a teacher or friend, but those images like king, master, father, or mother are too small for me now. God is the force of motion and light in the universe. God is the strength of life on our planet. God is the power moving us to do good. God is the source of love springing up in us. God is far beyond what we can comprehend.
Amen. Thank you. It's so easy to use Avinu Malkeinu as the example of the metaphors that maybe don't work as well for us anymore. And it's funny because many years that Ruth Brin poem is in our Machzor, and many years that poem is what we use to introduce Avinu Malkeinu, right? Our little way of kind of saying, we're gonna stick with it because it's got a great melody and we grew up with it. And there's even some power in the images, right? There's partial meaning, if not truth, in Father and King. But if we are stuck there, we got trouble. Thank you, Vita. Beautiful. So, life cycle of metaphor. The idea that metaphors are active at a certain point, and then they are dormant, and ultimately they may be extinct. So Ralph has raised his hand. I'm going to call on Ralph, but I just wonder if a few people want to, in the chat, put the first word is either active, dormant, or extinct, and then name a metaphor. And meanwhile, Ralph, please.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think sometimes the rationalists or people in science try to explain the world, and they really get boxed in pretty quickly. And then there are obviously some people don't have that hubris who realize there's something beyond that. We can't box it and we can't explain it. And then we get a sense of God. And in terms of metaphors, I like to connect it to God as a verb. So we're all kind of nouns and God is the verb. That was a famous title. So
Absolutely. David Cooper wrote the book God is a Verb, but its core for all of liberal theology, right? And the names that we often come back to get away from Avinu and Malkeinu and even Yod He Vav He, like Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be what I will be, right? Ehyeh is the future tense conjugation of the word to be, to exist. And so Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh is taking verbs and calling it noun. Who am I? What am I? What noun would best describe me? It is the noun of becoming, right? It is the gerund, right? I'm cheating. It's a noun, but it's really a verb. Right, and lots of other examples like that. Beautiful. Okay, so thank you, Evie. An example of an active metaphor are actually many of them are some of those that are in this book. And as we keep reading and exploring and sitting with it and hearing each other and our insights on it, I trust that images of God or godliness or divinity as fire and as water, as cloud and as rock will be ever more active metaphors for us. Nice, Larry, right? I am becoming what I am becoming, again, gerund, right? It's not an accident, by the way, that our movement renamed itself with a gerund, Reconstructing Judaism, which raised a lot of eyebrows, but also really says something about our entire approach. Nice. So community, love, art, nature, sickness, right? Lots of active, beautiful. Any other examples of, and it doesn't have to only be, thank you, Anne, doesn't have to only be in God. We're really exploring metaphors, and then we're going to apply it to spirituality. So yes, the notion that slavery is okay. And of course, it still exists in various forms. But the idea that you can simply use slave as in normal conversation, right? You know, as in some analogy or something, like it's almost a metaphor that was once active and became extinct, thank God, right? Patrimony needs to be extinct. Nice. And of course we could unpack that. And you know, does that mean we should never say Avinu Malkeinu, or is there room for it as metaphor, but nonetheless patrimony is extinct, right? And that's in the sense of patriarchy, and of course patrimony has its own field as well. So good. All right, very quickly, I'm going to screen share this, and then hopefully we're going to get to water before we run out of time. But of course, running out of time as a finite resource is itself one of those active metaphors. And yet it's dormant in the sense that we don't recognize it, but it is very much part of who we are. How metaphor works. Okay, so I love these. Anger is a hot liquid in a container. That is an operating metaphor that we use. I'm boiling mad. She blew her top. Blow off some steam, right? Many metaphors assume that somehow anger is a contained hot liquid that doesn't want to be contained. Or anger as a horse. Rein in one's temper. Harness your anger. Unbridled. Love this stuff, right? Ideas are food. Devour that book. Let the idea gel. Half-baked theory, right? All metaphor. No one is saying that ideas are actually food, but then we could develop it, right? I mean, the rabbis did that. The famous line, Im ein Torah ein kemach. Im ein kemach ein Torah. If there's no flour, F-L-O-U-R, no sustenance, then there's no Torah, because you got to live, right? Maslow's triangle, you need the base. But what good is the base without supporting the closer to the top in the self-actualization? And of course, that is for the rabbis Torah. So the converse is equally true. Without Torah, what good is bread or flour, right? So ideas are food, right? Or ideas are people, father of biology. Ideas died, right? A field in its infancy. Or commodities, package, worthless, valuable. And again, time. Wasting time, save hours, spend time, budget time. Time is money is maybe this is a little different because you could make a case for it, but it's maybe not entirely metaphorical, but the metaphor then takes over and becomes its own way of approaching the world. So metaphors, active, dormant, or extinct. And the question that Toba invites us to ask is, what are the functions we need a metaphor for divinity to fulfill? And if we had longer, we would spend some time on that one, because that itself is really interesting. Also interesting is the question of applying extinct here, right? For some of us, I think king is extinct. For others of us, there's still a really powerful tug to it, at least in the Hebrew, if not in the English. And some of us are somewhere in between, where it is conceptually extinct, but poetically still palatable, right? And we are going to, I think, in the coming decades, we're going to only see more of this, where some of us simply can't daven with the word melech anymore. And others have to daven with the word melech, or it's not davening. And ironically, those camps will probably both agree that king is largely an extinct metaphor. So to unpack that, come to the Reconstructionist conversation when we'll be tackling some of that. All right, and that's where Yud He Vav He He She It, all of that comes in, and all of that is in the last pages that Toba writes about metaphor before moving to water. So in the interest of time, to make sure that we, oh my God, how did it get to be 8:30? Yeesh. To make sure that we give at least a few minutes to this first unquenchable metaphor. Right? If time and money, right? And yet time flows, right? So time and water, somehow it all connects. I want to make sure that we take advantage of Zoom to be able to use art and music of different forms in a way that will actually sort of enlighten us in new ways. Because all of this is, right, if metaphor already goes at some level beyond logic, it's no longer about empirical truth or attempting definitions, then art and music and poetry become perfect ways in. So I said we'd be drawing from different cultures. I want us to take 1 minute. Classic image, roughly filling your screen. One minute. Think about the power of water. Luther. And anyone who wants to put words in the chat that this brings up for them, great.
And just to make this water metaphor even more complicated, the actual wood print is part of a series that is not about water, but is about Mount Fuji, which is a completely different metaphor.
So true.
Layers upon layers upon layers and layers.
Thank you for that. Right, and there it is in the background, and yet, in its own way, the star of the series, even if the wave seems to be the dominant at the moment. Nice. All right, get it in your mind's eye. I'm going to stop screen share. Thoughts on water as metaphor, inspired perhaps initially by this famous woodcut. Forceful, without water there is no life. Right, a canoe competition, threatening, engulfing, right? And noting how essentially Eastern it is in many ways, as Mark says, seeing all the facets of existence and time at once, an image that actually can be so multifocal. Water giving life, which we know, but also taking life away. And that is clearly a rogue wave of some sort, right? Stylized perhaps, or perhaps a literal tsunami. And we sadly have seen tsunami in Japan, and that even when you think you are safe on land, water is, instead of sustaining you, is drowning you. Shape of the cloud, nice. The oxygen, right? I mean, the very high hydrogen and oxygen of the H2O itself being literally recycled stardust, as we are. Kind of amazing, right? And yet soft and nourishing, eroding and nurturing. Beautiful, primordial, and Marcia introducing the blessing for water, which we're going to get to. Nice. Awesome. So we're already getting to some of the multivocality there. Peter, I see your hand up, please.
I see it as the paragraphs of the Shema come to mind. God is the consequence of our collective action or our lack of action, you know. I'll give you rain upon your land at the appointed time, the early rain and the later rain, if you behave. It's especially relevant in the parched West here.
Right. Here. Thank you. Coming to us from northern Colorado there. Thank you, Peter. Absolutely. And of course, that passage, Deuteronomy 11, goes on to say, take care then lest you turn away and serve false gods, because then if you do, I will shut up the heavens, the rains will no longer come in their season, the land will no longer yield its produce, and you will speedily be evicted from the good land that God is giving you, because water stops being a blessing and starts becoming a curse. Right? And of course, the climate imagery, with so many people in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27 this very moment, thinking and talking about this, the idea that we ourselves are the agents of turning the cycles of water from blessing toward curse, is as an anthropogenic, meaning humans caused it thing, right? Usually in this theology conversation where the big word we use is anthropomorphic, right? But both are important here. So thank you, really appreciate that. One or two others, perhaps. Anyone? Okay. So an image and a chant, please. Okay, I hope you can see. Kain nafshi ta'arog elecha Elohim. Someone unmute. Yes, you're seeing that. And then if all goes well, this will play. No promise.
Just as the deer longs for water by the riverbank, so does my soul long for you, oh God. Just as the deer longs for water by the riverbank,
One more time, see where it takes you.
Just as the deer longs for water by the riverbank, so does my soul long for you, oh God. Just as the deer longs for water by the riverbank, so does my soul long for you, oh God. Can't love she tired Elohim. Can't love she
Oops, sorry. Still going, hold on. Some of us chant is an authentic approach, some of us visual art. Reflections of different approaches to this idea of water and ultimacy. Anyone?
Fred,
Yes, please.
this is Debbie. I was just, the visual image, what struck me was it was the hubris on the part of humanity. We have the canoes, barely able to keep themselves, afloat. And I was just thinking about, the whole discussion about water as property rights, and how we think that we can control the force of water and divert it for commercial purposes, have control over it for various uses, and how we are limited. Water and nature is much larger than our human capacity to control it. Taking the discussion in a different direction, but that's actually what was going through my head as I started examining the image.
Nice. Thank you. Excellent. While I search for where I was, anyone else? I don't see hands at the moment.
Yeah, Fred, this is Larry. There's something about that amazing Shefa chant that you just played that makes me think that, does that fit into, what this book is talking about? I don't know if she gets into music, because I wouldn't call music metaphor. I mean, there's this palpable, like, gut feeling that at least I got from that music, and from the language. It all mixes up. But there's something about Shefa, the way she, again, the presence idea, that there's a presence that music gives, that I don't know if I'd call that metaphor. I don't know what I'd call it. But again, there's this divinity thing that can be evoked through this kind of music, which is extraordinarily powerful and does not seem metaphorical.
Nice. Thank you for bringing presence back. It's incredibly powerful. I agree. Nice. Anyone else?
Tom Armstrong has raised his hand.
Thank you. Please, Tom.
I'm grateful to Larry for bringing up the topic of music, because that is, for me, the most meaningful way I have of participating in this activity of whatever it is we're calling it. It's making music is a beautiful and moving experience for me, and it's in a way my form of worship. harking back all the way to the first thing that I brought up, though. What reason is there to believe, and believe is a word that Rabbi Spitzer uses, to believe that that experience of what you might call the divine, for me, is due to something supernatural, or is even supernatural perhaps not a required attribute of what we're referring to as God?
Nice. That supernatural may not be a required attribute. And that is so perfect for this, because after all, if it's not supernatural, it is natural. and that is exactly what she is doing here. In the company of Sally McFaig and others who would call themselves eco-theologians, as well as feminist theology. These are all, subsets that overlap, and overlap in turn with Reconstructionist theology, or liberal Jewish, or however you want to call it. But it is naturalistic theology. Can we locate holiness, divinity, ultimacy within nature to the point where it is actually the natural order itself that is miraculous, rather than the stories that claim to, at one point in history, have been a suspension of the natural order for the sake of one person or group at a time, right? I mean, the Red Sea is the classic example, but, healing a leper, or making the sun stand still so you can slaughter more of your enemies when the battle is going well. That's in the book of Joshua, right? We have, these are the examples that are sometimes given in the classic mode of faith. And yet, many of us know the beautiful prayer at the second to last stanza of the Amidah, Hoda'ah, gratitude, right? Thank you, God, for the miracles that are every day with us, for your wondrousnesses and goodnesses that are with us always, morning, noon, and night. And by that logic, the miracle is photosynthesis, right? The miracle is a stable orbit around a stable star. And so the miracle is fire and rock and water and cloud and all the images that we're talking here. Again, just like with your first one, Tom, not sure I'm satisfactorily addressing, but hopefully at least adding a little something. Does anyone else want to speak to this? I think it's a really important question, and Tom, you are certainly not alone in asking. Luther, please.
I will attempt to, because, well, I'm with Tom. The words of the prayers, to me, they're all metaphors anyway. But it's the music that really moves me. It's literally the music that moves me when I'm in a synagogue or any other holy place. But what occurred to me while Tom was talking was, music is one of the art forms that apparently is practiced by other species. Not only birds, but whales and so many other species, wolves, all have forms of music that they create. So something is really interesting in that, even if it's only a metaphor for something bigger.
Thank you. Nice. Okay.
Yeah, I would just want to throw in that the AWE all is a big factor here. That I think Heschel's the one who, well, he certainly said it to me, that that's sort of a gateway to whatever divinity might be. But all, like, frankly, Tom, you would understand this, that, I walk through the park and I see all the plants and the flowers and the leaves, And I know that it's Schrodinger's equation, right? Is making, there's this one equation that at some level makes all of that happen. And the fact that there's one equation that we could derive or not derive, but work with to actually come up with all this beauty, to me, that is awesome. And that is something that is you just want to bow and worship just in the face of that. So I think awe is a really important fact, something that's important to consider when discussing your questions, Tom.
If
Here,
I
here.
could just unmute myself for a second to affirm that. During the Amidah, I don't look at the prayer book. I look out the window because of the complexity you can see even by looking at the branches of a tree.
Yep. Thank you. Amen. Bob, Ann, Bob.
I was just going to say, Tom, that when people are making music together, they're collaborating. They're not contending with each other or fighting with each other. So I think music is a godly activity. I've seen music where there are instruments that pretend to be fighting with each other, but that's a kind of a joke, and it's still a collaboration.
Nice. Absolutely. Much is increasingly being shared about jazz theology, right? The ability to riff and to hold a motif, but to be creative, to take up the right amount of space, which sometimes is central, but often is background. There's a lot there too. So thank you. Sherry, please.
Well, so all of this for me gets back to the power of metaphor. I'm thinking about what Debbie wrote in the chat about believing in something larger than ourselves. And one of the things that one of the places where I find spirituality and the presence of God is actually in exactly the kind of conversation that we've had going on in the chat about all of the different ideas that the metaphor of water brings to us. And the notion that whatever ideas I have on my own, and I might have 25 of them, I get in a Zoom room with all of you, and there are another 100. And all of us get to something larger than ourselves through that conversation, through that act of imagining and sharing and exploring what this might mean, not because we're trying to pin it down, but because what we're doing is opening it up. And so we're therefore getting over and over to things that are larger than us as individuals and that enlarge the idea of God. And so anyway.
Beautiful. Thank you. And yet again, the power of language and metaphor, right? I mean, just think about the directionality of this. Pin it down versus lift it up. Right. And when we get to God as cloud, we may, hear some of that, the idea of expansiveness and height, that those, physical vector metaphors sometimes actually tap into something really powerful. Thank you so much for all of that, everyone. Phyllis, last word, and then we're going to just focus on a couple of practices as a take home, please.
Well, Fred, the metaphor of last word is too heavy for me to carry. So I just want to follow choir member Sherry and tell you that choir is a metaphor that we feel to a degree the transition from going from singing it, not singing for years and singing in boxes to what we experienced Saturday night and what people in the room experienced is just not something I can do by myself. And it exceeds any expectation, any practice, any formulaic intent. And there's no other way to end that.
Thank you. so appropriate that so many of these reflections come back to the communal piece, right? Water is not necessarily a metaphor that begs that, and yet when you stop to think about it, what is a water molecule, right? I mean, our experience of water is nothing but a community of molecules, right? And in fact, the very word water, which in English is singular, in Hebrew, water is plural, mayim, right? There's no such thing as singular water. And so water and community are maybe not the most obvious pairing, and yet at so many levels it works. Thank you. So for those who haven't read this, each chapter after the opening ones about metaphor in general, 8 or 9 of them exploring metaphor by metaphor, each one is about 15 pages of a mix of story and anecdote and theory and kind of laying out the metaphor with liberal reference to Jewish text along the way. But then the last 10 or so pages is a series of practices inspired by that metaphor. And some of them are easy and obvious, right? Drinking with intentionality is an example of that practice. But then what's Jewish about that? How do you consume with intentionality? You say a blessing, right? And so one of the practices here is practicing saying a blessing over liquid. I don't think I got a footnote in here, but ever since rabbinic school, I have been saying a blessing over water, and it is the Jeremiah version, right? There's that beautiful text of Jeremiah using the image of God as the fount of the living waters, the source of the living waters, Makor Mayim Chayim. And that just jumped out at me decades ago as like that's where it's at, because the Mayim Chayim, the living waters, are simultaneously the waters that themselves are spiritually alive. They gets to that, call it supernatural or call it the natural is super, right? Idea, but also it is the waters of life. It is the waters that sustain life. It is the ecological core reality that without clean water, our ecosystems and our human communities are nothing. And so Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Ruach HaOlam Makor Mayim Chayim. And I must have said that, tens of thousands of times by now, because it almost becomes, it's the opposite of an afterthought, a pre-thought, right? But, barely a thought. I'm about to sip liquid and I say those 9 words. That's an example of a practice. I'm using it in my terms, but 2 of the 11 pages of practice here are those. Those who have read it, and maybe those who have tried it, instead of me walking through what those practices are, if you have the book and are looking at page 63 through 74, and remembering a practice that really spoke to you, can I ask for 2 or 3 quick unmutes and pure testimonials of God as water practices while I plug my computer in? Because power is another metaphor for God. Anyone want to share a favorite water practice? Not everyone at once.
Well, I don't know if other people want to talk, but a life-changing moment for me was seeing a droplet of rainwater on a leaf, a leaf or grass or something, and the sun had just come out, and seeing the sun sort of reflect off of that drop of water, it was literally a life-changing moment for me. And so that's water, and it just touched something extraordinarily deep for me when that happened, when I was a young man.
Beautiful. So Toba doesn't say this in so many words, but applying that as practice, part of water practice could be spend time with the rain. Usually, once we know it's going to rain, we go inside and we try to have as little interaction with the outdoors as possible. Once in a while, we're back in that childlike experience, not so much when it's 38 degrees and raining, which is going to be a lot of soon, but you know, go out and splash in puddles, right? Or put your poncho on, or take the umbrella, but go out, right? The totality of those drops is like a free natural show of its own pyrotechnic equivalent that we should be paying through the nose to witness. And it's simply happening outside many days of any given month. And so simply to experience water when it's nearby is a water practice, and it may raise the theological. Tom.
You said half of what I was about to say anyway. I had not thought of having a water practice, but I do, you know, I do when I'm next to a large body of water, a lake or the ocean. I look at it and remember, just as I wrote in the chat, where does that water come from? And what a miracle it is that we live on this ball of rock that has a thin but not too thin coating of water on it that sustains all of the life on the surface of the planet. And you know, it's a unique, it's not maybe unique, but it certainly is an uncommon part of the universe that we live in or on.
Nice.
And the water always reminds me of that.
Yeah. John, I love what you wrote. I'd love to hear more. So I want to invite you to unmute in a moment if you're able and willing. Water practice is a haiku. I love it. I just want to note that a different water practice that with my sort of ecological hat on, which I never fully take off, right? But bioregionalism is a sub-discipline in ecology that implores us to develop a sense of rootedness in place. And I was going to mention this when we get to God as makom, place, but it works here too. And one of the bioregional questions is, when you are where you are, do you know what watershed you're in? Are you aware of the rain that does fall, of where it goes? And for that matter, in the human system, are you aware of the water that you consume, where it comes from? And simply locating ourselves in a map that is not political boundaries, but natural watershed boundaries, it is a whole different way of being. And then when you travel, it opens new vistas too. If you're like Tom and John and I and Phyllis and a number of others, right? When you ride a bicycle, you're acutely aware of the difference between going down toward a creek and going up toward a watershed break, because even a 1%, 2%, right? The things that you don't necessarily notice in a car, you will notice on a bike, and it opens incredible awareness of what it means to come to a small rivulet or down to a major river and back up the other side. And locating ourselves in proximity to natural bodies of water and watersheds is itself a water practice that will bring us close to makom, place, which is the name of God. So again, not in here exactly, but inspired by. Okay, eternal wave sets, healing like the sands of time, whisper that we're loved. Whisper. Thank you. We started with the Japanese woodcut and we're ending with the Japanese poetic form. So there's some nice bookend there. Yeah, go ahead and write your own 575 reflection on water and ultimacy. Water ultimate. There's line one. Okay. Triple divide peak in glacier. Right. Those moments when you realize, right? And I mean, just, anyone who drives to Ohio, right? When you just, looking at Sherry, right? But, you go those signs on 70 or 68, and if you're paying attention, then you're watching the elevations and you realize that when it says, wow, this is the Eastern Continental Divide, right? Like either this water is going to exit the Atlantic via the St. Lawrence Seaway up in the way northern, or it's going to come out the Chesapeake and elsewhere on the eastern seaboard. And then of course you go to a place like Glacier and it's as far as the Gulf of Mexico versus the Pacific, right? Or the Arctic, right? Right, locating ourselves. Nice. One or two more. Water practices.
I was thinking, Fred, this is Marcia, bringing it closer to home. I'm one who gets so involved sometimes that I just don't drink enough water. And that brings to mind the question of balance and self-care, as well as, that wonderful feeling of quenching and being satisfied. And that's, why I mentioned before, your blessing is beautiful, but it's always surprised me that the rabbis never had a specific blessing for water when it's so important to existence.
I began that practice out of a certain anger that shehakol niyeh bidvaro, for those who know the traditional system of brachot, the one that you say that everything comes into existence through God's word, shehakol niyeh bidvaro, it's the catch-all blessing. If it's not one of the 5 other categories, fruits, vegetables, fruit of the vine, etc., then and so it covers everything from water to chocolate to dead animals to potato chips. And so I said, okay, no, all right, potato chips, fine, right? There's a debate, actually, is it shehakol or is it pri ha'adama? But I don't eat animals, but I'm not vegan, and so I also have a new bracha for egg or dairy that is kind of an apologetic bracha, a consciousness of the systems that this meal is a part of, because it just doesn't feel like it should be in the same catch-all. And I also pull out chocolate because that is its own holiness, and I pull out water, right? And I'll still say shehakol over anything else that belongs, but not animal, not water, and not chocolate. So, yeah. Nice. Gordon, Jolie, please.
It's just Gordon tonight. My practice, I think, is when we're driving someplace and I look at a map, and if we're driving up in Maine or if we're driving on California or in the Cape, I always drive towards the water and go as far out on some peninsula as I can. Or if we camp, I look for something near a water, because just looking at the water fills something. It fills something. It's a little bit mystical. So I like, that's my water practice.
Beautiful. So that verse, we didn't actually unpack it. The verse that we heard Shefa Gold chant, Nafshi ta'arog, my nefesh, my soul longs, in the literal image of thirsts, right? My soul thirsts. It can only be quenched with water. My soul wants water. And so, of course, our bodies want water. And if we go 4 days without it, we're dead. But our souls want water in the metaphorical sense of water, but also whether we think of it as our aesthetic self or just our deepest self, right? We are drawn, we long for water. And that's why the classic, again, the vacation spot, the beach, the lake, etc. We are drawn. It's a piece of the human condition, and there is a certain holiness in that water, in the same way that maybe we are drawn to ultimacy, to holiness, to God. Anne, please.
Yeah, we've talked about water as a source of beauty and of nourishment, but the one thing we haven't talked about, which is sort of my practice, is as a cleansing agent. And the fact that we can, I know every time I take a hot shower, and I grew up in a home where we always didn't have the ability to have hot water whenever we wanted it. So I'm very, very conscious of how grateful I am. And it's like a little thing, it's like a practice. And so I always have to say thank you. Now, who I'm saying thank you to, I don't know, but I'm so thankful for all of us. We just turn something on and we have access to hot water, and it's a source of comfort, and it's also cleansing. And that's just water.
Oh, beautiful. So just water as cleansing, go back to the Leviticus idea of water, right? Like, how powerful. And those images, like water in Genesis is the substrate of all life. Water in Exodus is the birth canal that we go through the Red Sea to become a free people. And in Leviticus, it's a cleansing agent of spiritual. But then that idea of simply not taking running water for granted, just at a social consciousness level, let's all adopt that water practice of never turn on the faucet and never flush the toilet without saying thank you. Right? And that can be thank you to Washington's Sanitary Sewer Commission, or right, or it can be thank you to God as water, and it's a thank you that also comes with a little bit of guilt that not everyone has that even today. And the irony that the more water and the more hot water we use, then the more we put our descendants and the global south in hot water, right? Because of the energy footprint of that water, right? None of this is meant to be easy, but it connects us. It's back to that idea of mayim as plural. It connects us. And these are all things that we need to be thinking of. Myrna, thank you. We're sitting on a cliff at Peggy's Cove, watching the water, the feeling of being one with the universe and the infinite, and lo and behold, enlarged and tiny, yet part of the vast. Sounds like a published author. Thank you. Nice. Even the sound of water. Yes. Okay. Marilyn, and I think this is going to be the last word because we are way over time.
Too bad this is the last word because it's not very profound, but I was just thinking of my Israeli cousins and how they save the water that save the water that comes out of the shower head while they're showering, etc., because they have to conserve water. And that's just a daily practice for them. And when they come to the US and see us using water, they're horrified. Washing dishes or whatever. I told you it was mundane, but that was the image I had.
Not at all. My first ever trip to Israel at age 21, right before the Gulf War, because nobody wanted to go, so it was cheap, and I finally got to go. I was on a tour that we got to see Mikorot, the water industry of Israel, and they gave us these little stickers that were part of a public education campaign at the time. Chaval al kol tipat mayim. Chaval is this like heavy word of like, oh, what a loss, right? I mean, it's a word that is theologically laden with that level of loss, right? Chaval, chas v'shalom, right? Chaval al kol, for every or over every tipat mayim, drop of water, right? Each little drop, be that conscious. And that is a form of a water practice, and it's one that we would all do well to emulate, even if we don't live in Israel or California or South Africa or, and then name all the places that are water scarce, and we realize just how good we have it, Fort Collins. Let's not take that for granted, neither the running water nor the relative abundance and availability in the first place. All right, the last two practices that Toba has in this wonderful Drinking from God chapter are going with the flow. We're remembering that in navigating a river, you need to be reading the river. You need to know where you are and where you're headed, and use that as a constant, right? Kind of grow in life with your constant repositioning and cheshbon hanefeshing of doing your own introspection based on where you are and where you're going, and using the idea of go with the flow as a springboard for greater self-awareness. And the last one is appropriate for a Jewish studies and makom offering, activating Torah. And she describes a practice that our Catholic friends called Lectio Divina, where you basically take a Bible verse and you really sit with it, you meditate on it, you say it out loud, you feel it, you embody it. And there's all these beautiful verses of water and spirituality right there in our tradition. So a blessing to activate Torah. I hope that tonight has activated Torah in some new ways for us, that it's opening some new doors, perhaps for prayer, perhaps for our spiritual lives, or at least it kept us interested enough to want to keep exploring some more metaphors, and maybe one will work even better than water for some of us. Happy to stay on, but also happy to let you all go and go with the flow.
Many thanks. Well done.
Thank you, Fred. That was great.
Thank you. This was terrific.
Okay.
And just, okay, we're looking forward to the next installment in 2 weeks. We will, yes, thank you, Luther. Anticipated my comment.
Right.
And we will get the publicity out, and thank you for a wonderful introduction to the subject matter.
Fred, I've been sitting on a question. It's Amy.